Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at the museum's Roundhouse, one of its most unique and important facilities. We'll also explore the history of the railroad roundhouse for perspective. Today, this building is a beehive of activity year-round, maintaining the Colorado Railroad Museum's collection of steam and diesel locomotives, and also its entire collection of other rail vehicles, too. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today is a specialized railroad facility that dates from the era of steam locomotives. Come join me now as we explore the subject of the Roundhouse broadly. We'll also dive into the story of how, as the 21st century dawned, the Roundhouse right here in Golden was conceived, funded, and dedicated. As America's earliest railroads in the 1830s extended their tracks further and further, the number of locomotives and cars also grew. These all needed to be repaired and maintained, especially given they were lightly constructed, often overloaded, and operating on bumpy, uneven track. Steam locomotives especially needed maintenance facilities that could be used in all kinds of weather. After all, railroads were intended to operate year-round. For the first decade or two of American railroading, however, such facilities were primitive and mostly lacking. Mechanics often had to work without even a permanent roof over their head. Not surprisingly, the earliest indoor railroad sheds in the U.S. were a curious blend, sometimes incorporated into existing depots and other structures. As early as 1837, the first circular building for locomotive maintenance and storage was constructed in the United Kingdom. The Roundhouse thus was born, incorporating a series of tracks radiating out from a central pivot point. A turntable was typically installed, allowing one or two tracks to access the structure from outside and all other tracks to be served via the turntable, which could be rotated to any track within the complex. The railroad roundhouse would become ubiquitous, associated with railroading not only here in the U.S. but throughout the world during the steam locomotive era. The roundhouse not only provided a sort of warehouse to store locomotives overnight, but it was also a place where regular daily and weekly maintenance could be facilitated. Often an adjacent machine shop or similar structure would provide the necessary parts and tooling for heavy repairs when they were needed. The size of locomotives and their tenders, at first quite small and lacking much capacity, was matched by the sizes of their roundhouses and other facilities. The oldest surviving roundhouse in the U.S. today dates to 1856, just prior to the Civil War. The war caused extensive destruction of railroad facilities, and the replacements grew in size to match larger locomotives that replaced older models. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, roundhouses and their associated turntables were growing once again out of necessity. As railroads expanded across the West, roundhouses followed. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads built structures to suit the terrain and weather conditions along their routes. None of these early Transcontinental Railroad roundhouses still exists. Roundhouses sometimes were fully enclosed, as is the case with this Baltimore and Ohio railroad example, which still stands today in Martinsburg, West Virginia. This design harkened back to earlier British examples, but it certainly was effective in cold and snowy climates. More to the point, however, a full circle roundhouse was best suited for busy terminals and junction points. More typically in the U.S., roundhouses were built to only a portion of a full circle, depending on the size of the railroad and the importance of the specific location operationally. On smaller railroads, particularly short lines, the entire roster of locomotives might be counted on just one or two hands, necessitating perhaps an equivalent number of stalls or tracks at most. There were also other kinds of locomotive maintenance facilities too. On smaller railroads, Sometimes an engine house would suffice at a remote location, housing maybe 1 or 2 locomotives. If space was at a premium, perhaps a number of engine stalls were arrayed more like a barn to fit into a narrow corridor. And sometimes a roundhouse might actually be a square, even if it's served by a central turntable. Roundhouses and turntables tended to be replaced or enlarged as the size of steam locomotives grew. By the early 20th century, some of these facilities were accommodating locomotives that were over 100 feet long. Before the end of the steam era, locomotives would grow to over 120 feet in length together with their tenders, requiring some big facilities indeed. By the mid to late 19th century, railroad roundhouses were a common part of the American landscape. They served in big cities and small towns, in established communities and remote locations on the edge of the frontier. In the railroad environment, perhaps only depots and water towers were more common structures. As America's railroad network grew along with traffic levels, the size of these facilities also grew. Major Eastern and Midwestern companies, such as the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Central Railroad of New Jersey, built massive roundhouses at key locations. There were plenty of smaller roundhouses built as well, serving far-flung communities with less traffic. Colorado and the Rocky Mountain West had their share of roundhouses. Early railroad lines, such as the Union Pacific and the Kansas Pacific, sported handsome structures along their routes, stretching west from Omaha and Kansas City into Wyoming and on to Denver. One of these still stands in lonely Hugo on Colorado's eastern plains. The Denver and Rio Grande, of course, pioneered narrow-gauge railroading in Colorado, headquartered in Denver. Its sprawling Burnham Shops complex south of downtown featured a roundhouse along with numerous other facilities for building and repairing the railroad's growing fleet of locomotives, passenger, and freight cars. Over time, Burnham's roundhouse changed from narrow gauge to dual gauge to standard gauge. The Rio Grande had a profusion of roundhouses elsewhere in Colorado, given its far-flung network and busy traffic levels. Especially important narrow gauge facilities were located in Salida and Alamosa, along with Durango. And of course, as the railroad standard gauged, new facilities were built and old ones upgraded to keep up with the demand in places like Pueblo, Minturn, and Grand Junction. Today, the railroad's former Durango roundhouse, rebuilt after a 1989 fire, remains a busy repair facility for the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad. Over in Chama, New Mexico, 2 stalls remain from the original Rio Grande roundhouse at this location, serving the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. Colorado's famed 3-foot gauge South Park line built a noteworthy stone roundhouse in remote Como at the junction of its routes to Leadville and Gunnison. Today, this roundhouse, along with adjacent facilities, is enjoying a rebirth. The South Park line had other, smaller roundhouses, including one in Leadville, a portion of which remains today. A large roundhouse in Golden, at the foot of Clear Creek Canyon, is long gone, along with the railroad's once extensive downtown Denver facilities. Colorado's standard gauge interchange railroads all had roundhouses here too. The busy Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe built perhaps the most monumental one in La Junta, while the Rock Island and the Missouri Pacific had roundhouses in Colorado and across the Kansas state line as well. The Colorado Springs roundhouse that once served the fabled Colorado Midland still stands today, adaptively reused to house several businesses. All across the U.S., the railroad roundhouse has vanished almost completely from the landscape. Some states haven't a single surviving representatives, while others host just a few well-known favorites, including the former Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Roundhouse in Scranton, Pennsylvania, that is today home to Steamtown National Historic Site. Perhaps the most striking example is found in Baltimore. The fully enclosed structure once served the former Mount Clair Shops complex of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and today is home to the B&O Railroad Museum. This beautiful example of engineering was originally completed in the early 1880s. It was rebuilt after heavy snows in early 2003 collapsed portions of the unique roof structure. The former Southern Railway Roundhouse at Spencer, North Carolina remains standing, as does much of the central of Georgia's Savannah Roundhouse facility. Both are transportation museums today. The Henry Ford Museum in Greenville Village in Michigan has a striking example of an 1884 brick structure that was moved from the small town of Marshall. Out west, Railtown 1897 State Historic Park in California's rural Sierra foothills preserves the former Sierra Railroad shops and roundhouse with a lengthy history of movie and television credits. Finally, outside of Colorado, the only surviving 3-foot narrow gauge roundhouse of note is found in Rock Hill Furnace, Pennsylvania, on the East Broad Top, which today is enjoying a rebirth. The idea behind a roundhouse varied, but in general it served two purposes: overnight storage of locomotives, whether they were being kept hot or cooling down for maintenance, and a place to perform regular ongoing maintenance, including cleaning out smoke boxes and lubricating running gear. The maintenance needs of steam locomotives were significant and constant. On larger railroads, the roundhouse was often close by other shop buildings, where major rebuilds and heavy overhauls would be performed. These railroads typically had one or more central shop facilities, which adopted that railroad's mechanical standards and took on major projects such as constructing new locomotives or rebuilding and upgrading existing ones. On smaller railroads, the roundhouse was often the only place to do maintenance and repair work. A small machine shop could often be found on site to support the railroad's needs. If a job was simply beyond its capabilities, such as rebuilding after a wreck, the smaller railroad would ship its locomotive off to a larger railroad shop and pay for the necessary work to be done. The direction locomotives were pointed inside a roundhouse was sometimes a point of divergence. The most common practice was to have locomotives head forward off the turntable into the stalls. This had the advantage of leaving more room around the front end of the locomotive, where most of the working parts of the engine are found. Sometimes locomotives were backed in, although often this was just for show. Smoke jacks were common fixtures in the ceiling of each roundhouse. These specialized smoke vents were designed to direct smoke up and out of the building, although electric fans made them much more dependable. Still, the roundhouse was often a smoky place in which to work when locomotives were being readied for service. As steam locomotives grew larger and longer, sometimes they would no longer fit on turntables or even inside the building stalls. Typically, the roundhouse itself would need to be enlarged and a longer turntable installed, both expensive undertakings. In warmer climates, especially in later years, sometimes locomotives were serviced outside, harkening back to the earliest days of railroading. The diesel locomotive would ultimately make the railroad roundhouse obsolete. Why? Well, diesel electrics did not require maintenance as frequently as steam locomotives, so the number of such facilities could be reduced greatly. Diesel locomotives instead depended largely on component changeouts. Instead of rebuilding an engine or a traction motor in a shop, for instance, the ailing component would simply be changed out with another one in working order. Along with this, consider the most basic fact. When diesel electrics need servicing, it doesn't much matter which direction they're facing. In U.S. practice, diesel locomotives were, and still are, generally operated in such a manner as to make turning unnecessary at the end of the line. Thus, not only did roundhouses become obsolete, but also the turntables that had once served them. When the Colorado Railroad Museum first opened at its Golden location in 1959, it didn't take long for the first steam operations to get underway. By 1963, Denver and Rio Grande Western locomotive number 346 was operating occasionally on a short, curved section of track. Around 1964, The museum even erected a water tower to use in filling the tender of the locomotive. Train operations continued for several decades, but by the early 1990s it had become obvious that a proper place was needed to perform maintenance and repairs. When museum founder and longtime executive director Bob Richardson retired in 1991, his successor, Charles Albee, stated his strong desire to help bring the museum into a new era of railroad preservation. Just over 2 years later, in fall 1993, a letter was mailed out to all museum members announcing the start of an ambitious fundraising program. A new library to house the museum's extensive archives, plus a building in which to perform rail vehicle restoration and maintenance were both planned. For good measure, the goal would include extending the museum's operating trackage to form a complete loop. This was a huge undertaking, eclipsing all the museum had attempted previously. An initial fundraising goal of $1 million was set, and the real work began. Not only did building concepts have to be turned into reality, but also the fundraising efforts would continue for the next several years. Museum members and supporters graciously contributed, demonstrating the worthiness of the cause to foundations and other funding entities that also stepped up. Construction projects often have a variety of related but sometimes unexpected requirements that turn up midstream. As it turned out, there would be a number of these. On the positive side, municipal water and sewer services were extended along West 44th Avenue just in time for the museum to connect its new facilities and take the existing building off an aging septic system. Of course, this new opportunity would add to the overall price tag. Another unexpected twist arose related to zoning. When the museum had first relocated to Golden, it had been a private enterprise, creating a new business on existing agricultural property. This would need to be rectified by rezoning the museum's acreage, hand in hand with conducting soil testing and beginning preliminary design work. Fundraising progress was announced at 50% of the overall goal by the end of 1994. In early 1995, the first major step in implementing this bold capital improvement program occurred when the museum acquired the former Iron Horse Motel property, just east of the main entrance to the museum. Established by Richardson in 1959 with the goal of funding the museum in its early years, the motel had been sold off after just a few years and declined in stature. By late 1995, the museum announced that the architect had completed drawings for the library building, which would be constructed first. The zoning changes had been approved, and fundraising was still continuing. Because of a few changes to anticipated expenditures, the goal was now $1.2 million. By the end of the year, 70% of this total had been raised, and the museum's leadership was confident that the goal would be reached by a forthcoming deadline of June 1st, 1996. Things started to move quickly at this point. In May 1996, ground was broken for the new Robert Richardson Library. The Iron Horse Motel was fully closed down that July, and a suitable turntable was found in Kansas and transported to the museum just a couple months later. The following year, the old motel was finally demolished. In the interim, construction of the library had been completed. Perhaps most importantly, the choice of building style for the new restoration facility had finally been pinned down. At first, an engine house was suggested, but the museum's leadership agreed that a roundhouse would be far more suitable, especially with a turntable as part of the overall plan. By 1998, work was also underway in earnest for the museum's new track loop, with a survey completed and the necessary rail and hardware acquired. Design work on the new roundhouse was also proceeding, with architect Nick Antonopoulos being the son of the designer for a well-known house in the region. This new roundhouse would be based on typical railroad practice, using concrete blocks as a modern building material, but faced in older style brick. Doors would come from the Denver and Rio Grande Western's Alamosa Roundhouse, which was in the process of being demolished. The museum's new operating loop opened in the summer of 1999. A month later, in August, Cornelius and Janet Houck rode a special train around the loop to break ground on the new Cornelius W. Houck Roundhouse facility. Along with its turntable and fan tracks for exhibits and storage, the 5-stall structure promised long overdue covered space for repairs and restoration work. At long last, the museum's Roundhouse was about to become reality. Even as construction was underway, some last-minute fundraising was taking place. Construction costs were rising quickly in the Denver area, and more requirements related to the county's permitting process had also added to the toll. Actual construction of the building was accomplished quickly. Photos taken in early February 2000 showed the roof not yet complete. By late May, everything but the doors had been installed. A dedication ceremony was scheduled for July 15th. A large crowd assembled that morning as members of the local Masonic Lodge performed an intricate cornerstone laying ceremony, one reserved typically for important structures. There was one final step remaining. The turntable needed to be installed, and tracks accessing the structure were still to come. These would be complete by the end of 2000. The Roundhouse at the Colorado Railroad Museum was finally open for business, ready to begin restoration and maintenance of the museum's unparalleled collection of rail vehicles from Colorado and the Rocky Mountain region. In the years since, the Roundhouse has been home to numerous successful projects. Denver and Rio Grande Western number 346 has seen its share of maintenance and repairs there. And when the time came to restore Rio Grande K37 steam locomotive number 491 to operation, the first major change to the structure was made. The building wall was removed and a shed-like extension was installed on the westernmost track, allowing the massive narrow-gauge locomotive to fit inside, including its tender. Most recently, the Roundhouse was the location for final assembly steps in the completion of a 14-year restoration of Rio Grande Southern 10-wheeler number 20. Other recent projects have included a former Union Tank Line's Gramps tank car and the rebuilding of end platforms for 1881 vintage Denver and Rio Grande Western narrow-gauge coaches. As of 2021, with 3 steam locomotives capable of operation, the Roundhouse is a busy place. The tracks are rarely empty, except on occasional weekends where a steam locomotive or two might be out operating. Thanks for joining me today. The Colorado Railroad Museum's Roundhouse may be a replica, but it is so well designed that today it's often mistaken for a vintage facility. Equally important, the work that continues under its roof is part of preserving not only the physical evidence of Colorado's railroads, but also the skills of their many diverse workers as well. I hope you've enjoyed this brief tour of the history and function of railroad roundhouses and the story behind the museum's successful project to construct its Cornelius W. Houck Roundhouse. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.